Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited for this event, which was postponed. It was supposed to happen last December, so we're very excited to finally get to it. Today, my name is Madiha Tahir, and I'm a Mellon postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Imagination in the Borderlands at ASU.
Hello, everyone. My name is Karim Malek. I'm a collaborator at Technologies of Power, a general editor at Borderlands, the online open access platform of the Journal for Comparative Studies of South Asian, African, and Middle Eastern Studies, and the Muhammad Ali Foundation postdoctoral fellow at the University of Durham, the United Kingdom.
So today, before we get started, I again want to note and acknowledge the events that are happening right now, in particular, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. As scholars and people with roots in the regions that the US has devastated, we have watched the images from Ukraine with horror and sadness. But we also want to remind our audience that US wars are not yet over. The US continues to be a colonial settler state, and it continues to drone bomb brown and Black countries abroad. These events are some of the backdrop for our conversation today, which is going to be about memory and digital resistance. So we're very happy to host Sarah Hamid, Imran Ferrous, and Majd Al-Shahabi as part of our second season of our continuing series, Technologies of Power. Since last fall, we have been hosting a group of speakers every other week to discuss the multiple wars that have been waged over the last 20 years. And you can find the full recording of our events on our YouTube channel, and that'll also be posted in the chat. So today's event picks up where some of our earlier conversations left off. During a previous discussion on enclosure and digital enclosures, we asked about how digital technologies extend erasures from the settler colonial state of Israel to the penal colony of China to qualified racialized citizenship within the US. With Sarah, Imran, and Majd today, we'll ask about the possibility of shaping memory as an act of digitally enabled resistance against erasure in Afghanistan, in Palestine, and in the US.
This thread also picks up on our last event on trace, methods, and means, where we discussed memory and archives as a site of contestation. Keeping that conversation in mind, we can ask an interesting set of questions today. First, what in the act of creating memories constitutes a political gesture in the present and for the future? Second, what is the relationship between digital technologies, resistance, and memory?
So you can find the full biographies of our speakers in the chat, but I'm going to introduce them briefly today, right now. Sarah Hamid is an abolitionist and organizer working in the Pacific Northwest. She leads the Policing Technology Campaign at the Carceral Tech Resistance Network, an archiving and knowledge sharing network for organizers who are building community defense against the design, rollout, and experimentation of carceral technologies. We also have with us today Imran Ferrous. He's an Austrian-Afghan journalist and author who has been focusing on the US war on terror, and especially the American drone program for almost 10 years. His work has appeared in a range of publications, including Foreign Policy, The Intercept, The New York Times, The Atlantic, and Der Spiegel. He is the founder of Drone Memorial that remembers the victims of US drone strikes, and you can find the links to that in the chat. And finally, we have with us today Majd Al-Shahabi. He is a technologist and urban planner who is interested in knowledge production outside of large institutions. He uses open methodologies and technologies to help alternative archives manage, publish, and activate their collections. He is also the co-founder of Palestine Open Maps, a project to open source historical colonial maps of Palestine. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So let me explain how we're going to run today's event. Each of the speakers has pre-recorded a brief presentation. We will play all three videos and then open the floor for questions. We encourage the audience to ask questions and post comments in the chat. We also encourage the panelists to engage each other's presentations. We look forward to an engaging conversation, and our first presentation is by Sarah Hamid.
My name is Sarah Hamid, and I lead the Policing Technology Campaign at the Carceral Tech Resistance Network. I've been asked today to speak to you about memory, but before doing so, I want to introduce our network and the kind of work that we do. CTRN is a coalition of organizers who are campaigning against the design, experimentation, and rollout of technologies by police, prison, border enforcement, and commercial partnerships. We work to abolish the carceral state and its attendant technologies by building community knowledge and community defense. Our group is made up primarily of femme, Black, immigrant, and POC organizers. My own work is primarily embedded in Portland, Oregon, but CTRN has organizers in most West Coast US cities. The network was created out of two primary needs. First, we started to realize that these technologies, often rolled out at a very local scale, have afterlives. They travel to other contexts where communities may have less familiarity with them or no organized base prepared to confront and dismantle them. So there was a need to knowledge share and foster mentorship between different community organizations. Second, we felt an urgent need to build a different relationship to the cataloging, databasing, and archiving practices that are widely deployed in movement spaces, but which also share a troubled history with the exact same surveillance technologies that we were working to dismantle. The kind of technologies that we build campaigns against include CCTV, face printing, DNA and biometric databases, acoustic gunshot detection, drones, electronic monitoring, AI and risk profiling algorithms, and carceral content moderation schemes, all of which function as weapons when in the hands of law enforcement or prison administration. That makes our work appear incredibly in vogue. Our technological present and the rate at which the media we consume represents it back to us makes us feel as though these struggles are new or newly born of the past 20 years. In fact, a lot of academics and journalists who have an investigative relationship to these technologies take a similar posture. That, for instance, predictive policing is a new innovation, making, say, a multi-year embedded ethnography with the Los Angeles Police Department to study their most recent update of predictive policing techniques feel like urgent research in order to contend with the emerging horrors of our technological present. This is where memory plays a key role. Part of what seduces firms and state actors to adopt these new technologies is the marketing narrative technologists craft around these tools so as to make them appear cutting edge and new. But it's no accident that these technologies are haunted by the logics of racialization, eugenics, segregation, land enclosure, and racial banishment schemes, i.e. sciences that have long been dismissed as racist and empirically bankrupt, but scientists that never really left us and are finding new life amid carceral technologies. When we're talking about the long history of carceral technologies, when we are talking about carceral technologies, we are talking about the long history of carceral technologies, which includes lanterns, sentry boxes, calipers, or pin maps, which were analog hotspot mapping techniques used to criminalize entire neighborhoods and communities. We are also talking about the long history of carceral practices, like forced sterilization, medical experimentation in prisons, work homes, and security landscaping, which is architectural techniques popularized in the service of police surveillance, such as stripping entire urban neighborhoods of greenery. Computational tools wielded by the carceral state are an inheritance of that history. So when we talk about carceral technologies, it's important to note that we are not just talking about digital technology. We are working with an inheritance that predates digital technology. As abolitionists, we fight to dismantle the system that makes these practices possible. We are positioning ourselves against a category of violence, carceral violence. And it's a category of violence that has been stabilized in Anglo-America and its empire for at least 200 years. And these tools are simply the most recent iteration of technology through which that violence is enacted. More importantly, we are organizing in contexts and communities that have a long history of fighting against carceral violence, communities that have acquired knowledge about how to fight and build safety against the rollout and experimentation of carceral programming, whether analog or digital. Our work is multi-generational, and we honor the knowledge that our ancestors used to fight for their survival, and we use that knowledge to fight for our own. Carceral technologies, as we understand it, are technologies that are bound up in the control, coercion, capture, and exile of entire categories of people. These tech and the industries and state actors that scaffold their use are the inheritance of a long history of racialized surveillance, objectification, and developmentalism targeting Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and poor communities in the United States. Carceral technologies are frequently deployed experimentally and are destined for commercial use, meaning that they exploit the visibility and exposure that our communities have for profit or knowledge production in the name of industry, the state, and academic innovation. This innovation experimentation occurs at the expense of the safety and well-being of our communities. CTRN seeks to build circuits of information exchange between community organizations across contexts and causes. Through community archiving and pooling of our collective expertise through analog and digital networks of knowledge sharing, we seek to amplify the capacity of community organizers to resist the encroachment and experimentation of harmful technologies. A few things to note. We're a US-based network, which means that our organizing is situated within the specific historic struggles that impact racialized and minoritized groups within and against those borders. This also positions us in a specific relationship to empire and the relations of production that tech industries benefit from. What we've learned from our lived experiences and organizing work is that empire and its conquests are not spatially bounded. Instead, the colonies are imbricated throughout the continental United States, and the techniques of war, extraction, control, and violence that are exercised in the global South are innovated and refined domestically. A good case study for this is predictive policing technologies, which is a technology that feels like it's on its last iteration as it's being rebranded right now as a way for police departments to identify and root out their own quote-unquote systemic biases. We can only hope. Predictive policing, which was rolled out in the mid-2000s, wasn't even really developed for the United States, which has a high threshold for things like accountability and transparency. But when predictive policing first came to American police departments, the marketing line from industry was that these departments were resource scarce. Predictive policing, the story went, could help law enforcement agencies save money. In the context of the George Floyd uprisings and what we've experienced over the past year and a half in the fight to defund municipal police departments, that argument is absurd. American police departments are far from resource scarce. But that argument wasn't really for us. That argument was for police departments that really are resource scarce. It's a sales pitch for police departments in Karachi. So it's no accident that when the NIJ's 2009 Predictive Policing Innovation Grant, which funded the Chicago's now deprecated Strategic Subject List, or HEAT list, seeded the development of risk assessment technologies that served as templates for police departments throughout the world. They also served as templates for military detention algorithms in Iraq and Afghanistan and helped support counterinsurgency efforts there. Memory works its way into these histories because for many of us, events from a decade ago are having a direct effect on how our communities can move across the world today in 2021. Memory also works at a different scale here. We begin with the premise as an organization that we are existing in an imperialist state with a white supremacist and settler colonial inheritance in which policing is a category of violence. The tools and technologies of policing, then, function in the service of racist violent work and the racist violent work of the carceral state. For many of us like myself, we live with diasporic memory in which home and here bleed into each other in really strange ways. Recently, it was revealed that an app that Muslims have been using all over the world to notify them when it was time for prayer was used to track their location and repackaged and sold for military intelligence purposes. Our own personal history and memory was therefore being tracked. This revelation was horrifying in and of itself, but what became more horrifying was the slow realization that these data were making meaning at a network scale. And the technologies of profiling and identification and prediction, which invariably make their way into the context of war and empire, go through a process of refinement and recalibration. The data harvested from American Muslims, therefore, is being used to build tools of war to murder our kin that isn't faceless or nameless because even though we are here and they are there, they live in our memory. That personal memory was being weaponized against our own people in ways we hadn't anticipated. The same can be said for technologies like facial recognition technology. Facial recognition technology exploded after the commercial rollout of artifacts like face printing, which was used to unlock iPhones. So the consumption habits of empire was being used in a way to make this technology readily accessible, and every time it was being used, it was being made better. And all the while, the few seconds that we saved to unlock our phones was being used to refine a technology that can now better identify our distant kin in other parts of the world. People with our eyes, our faces, our noses can now be better identified because we use that tool to unlock our phones faster. The third way that memory affects this work is something that has a bit more startling effect when we think of the third way that the memory affects this work is something that has to do with the way in which the past 20 years is replaying itself in ways that we also hadn't anticipated. Recently, the Biden administration rolled out its new war against domestic terror. And for those of us who were alive during the rollout of the first war on terror, we start to realize those haunting patterns. We start to realize how things like ideas and beliefs are easily categorized and identified in systems that are fraught with failure and error, and how it can have devastating effects on people's lives. Social media flagging systems that were designed for gang policing in urban contexts were studied by DARPA to monitor ISIS recruitment and to monitor quote-unquote Islamic radicalization in the context of CVE and the first war on terror. The racially hostile relationship that American police had with vulnerabilized communities, what were commonly referred to as low information environments, were then weaponized to function as an isomorphic innovative domain for U.S. imperial contexts. Today, as social media content moderation schemes are being leveraged to identify domestic terrorism, those same techniques are reemerging, and it's obvious what the effects are going to be. There's going to be more rates of error and more mistakes made that are going to have devastating consequences, not necessarily for white supremacists, but most definitely for water defenders, for those fighting for Black lives, for immigrants, and those who the state has historically and continuously defined as a threat. The work in front of us now then is to build globally. The economies through which these technologies circulate imply that the bans and moratoriums that we enact domestically mean that the market then gets flooded for commercial and state use globally. Abolition, Ruth Wilson Gilmore tells us, must be red, it must be green, and it must be international. As these technologies of war and carceral violence are intimately tied to our lives and to our distant kin, so too must our strategies of resistance be intimately bound together. This fight is now a global fight.
So my name is Imran Ferrous. I'm a journalist based in Germany at the moment. And for almost a decade, I'm writing about the American war on terror, especially in Afghanistan, which is the birthplace of my parents, a place I'm regularly reporting from. The word I'm focusing today is memory. So memory is, of course, a crucial aspect of my work. In 2013, I started with a journalistic project called Drone Memorial, which was focusing on the civilian victims of drone strikes all around the world, especially in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And obviously, there was a reason why I started to do this. As I said, I'm focusing on the war on terror, especially on drone strikes, night raids, and all these other brutal things that are happening since then for almost 10 years. And when I started to focus on drone operations in Afghanistan, I was really surprised that there wasn't much about the victims. I reported from Afghanistan, and back in 2013, 2014, I noticed that there isn't much about these developments. Actually, when I started to do a lot of research in 2011, 2012, the era when Barack Obama increased his shadow wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, all these places, I was astonished that there was so little memory about the actual victims of this war. So in 2013, I decided to make something very simple to remember those who have been killed. And it was also tied to my journalistic work. So it wasn't just blatant activism, but it was tied to my work. And I started to collect the names of civilian drone strike victims from all around the world. There weren't much names, so it was difficult to collect the data because obviously just a handful of researchers and journalists were focusing on them. So I collected what I got and started to write it down. Of course, I checked all these persons, all these identities and backgrounds. And afterwards, I just put all of it online on a website called drawmemorial.com. And actually, at first, I was like, okay, who cares about this work? Will it really have an impact? What will the people think about it? But quickly I decided that that's not important. It's important what I am thinking, and I have to keep talking about this, why I'm doing that. So the reason why I did that was that, of course, as I mentioned, there wasn't much available, and also I thought, why are there so many other memorials? I mean, when it comes to war, a thing like a memorial, remembering the victims, is something very, very crucial. I was born and raised in Austria in Europe, and from my childhood on, I always learned about the Second World War in school. So, the Second World War, the victims of the war, especially, of course, the Holocaust, but also the fallen soldiers, fallen American soldiers, fallen British soldiers, and you see so many memorials also when it comes to the First World War, also when it comes to other wars that are taking place around the world. You also see a lot of memorials for American soldiers who participated in the war on terror. You also see, of course, a huge memorial for the victims of the September 11 attacks, which almost took place a year ago. But why aren't there any memorials for the victims of the war on terror? And these victims are, of course, I would say, maybe almost countless, because from the very beginning on, after the Americans invaded Afghanistan in late 2001, and after all the other wars started in Iraq and all the other places I mentioned, you couldn't really, nobody started to count. Nobody started to count the victims. The Western world just counted its own victims, and the Western world decided who is worthy to count and who is not. And many nameless and faceless Afghans, Pakistanis, Iraqis, Somalis, Yemenis, these people were not worthy to count. So I thought, okay, if nobody's doing that, I will try to do that. And Of course, I wasn't alone with that. I was alone with Drone Memorial, to be honest, but I know today that all around the globe there are many other engaged, journalists, activists who are really trying to make a difference and trying to, make factual reporting what happened, how many people have been killed, and everyone who knows the number. For example, when it comes to the victims of the war on terror in Afghanistan, at the moment we are talking about at least 43,000 people. Of course, not all of them have been killed by drone strikes, but a lot of them have been killed by drone strikes because thanks to George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump, Afghanistan was the most drone bombed country all around the world. It just changed recently, actually almost a year ago, because the Americans and the Taliban signed a deal, a so-called peace deal, withdrawal agreement, and since then airstrikes in Afghanistan decreased a lot. So although the violence in Afghanistan is escalating at the moment, it's still something good for many people that these drone strikes are not taking place like in the past, and that my drone memorial actually has some kind of pause because before that I always had to check what happened there, what happened in this village, what happened in this area, and trying to get as much names as possible. So this is one aspect which I wanted to tie to the word memory. Another thing which is also important to me is how memory, or let's say, how even people within Afghanistan make, or let's say, people within Afghanistan who are at least involved in a way of, creating memorials, which is kind of questionable in my eyes. For example, I noticed that when last year a well-known group in Kabul, in Afghanistan's capital, created a graffiti of George Floyd, who was murdered by the police in the United States. And first of all, many people shared this picture. I was like, okay, that's interesting. This is George Floyd on the street in Kabul, and this is something many people do not expect. This is something which creates awareness so that even the people in Afghanistan learn about the story of George Floyd and what happened to him. So, of course, because of this, also many people shared this picture, and you could see it everywhere on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. So, George Floyd in Kabul became quite famous. After some time, I started to question that because, of course, it's important to remember what happened to him, but the whole context and the whole framing was, in my eyes, very, very questionable. First of all, George Floyd was the victim of police violence in the United States. So when it comes to police violence and the huge military-industrial complex which is involved in it, which is involved in the American police and globalizing this violence, which happened through the war on terror, it's just half of the story because, of course, you have to talk when you talk about George Floyd. You have to talk about all these police developments, in my eyes, and you have to talk about the militarization of the police and how these things were globalized and brought to other countries. So actually, it would make sense if we say, so we have George Floyd being killed by the police in the United States, but we also have innocent Afghan villagers who have been killed through night raids by the American military, and that these events should be seen as some kind of extension of the police violence within the United States. But the message of the graffiti of George Floyd in Kabul totally ignored that, and it had a certain, of course, it had a very obvious reason why this was the case. The group that made the graffiti was actually sponsored by the US Embassy in Kabul. So they were not, I mean, that's my guess, but I think that was probably the case. They were not really comfortable with showing this side of the story that, police violence in Afghanistan, it's not enough to show a picture of George Floyd in Kabul and that's it. You have to point at the culprits who are doing similar things in Afghanistan. And in many cases, these culprits are funded by the United States, or even the US military itself is directly responsible for it. As I said, during the last 20 years, a lot of night raids took place all over the country, and they radicalized a lot of people because the American soldiers and their Afghan allies killed a lot of civilians, and a lot of these civilians, or a lot of their family members, they started to join militant groups like the Taliban. So we could see a certain backlash taking place over there. And also, of course, there is police violence in Afghanistan too. The Afghan police is probably one of the most brutal police you could imagine. Famous police commanders are known for torturing people, murdering them, caging them in their hidden dungeons, who are hidden, in their big fancy houses, and at the same time they're involved in human trafficking, drug trafficking, a lot of these things. And these are the people who were brought to power by the United States, by the US military, by the CIA. So it would make sense even if you just draw George Floyd on the streets of Kabul, and if you share it on your official Instagram account, to also point at these things. This didn't happen. So, in my eyes, this was a questionable memorial. And of course, things like that could also take place because there are also many debates about memorials, about how to remember victims. And I hope that, especially in Afghanistan, these debates will continue because we are talking about a country that is haunted by war and chaos for almost 4 decades. And you see so many graveyards all over the country, but you barely see real memorials. So at the end of the speech, I want to quote a cab driver I met in Kabul. Of course, journalists shouldn't quote cab drivers, but this is not in a reporting context. And I talk to many people when I'm in Afghanistan, and of course, I'm also talking a lot to cab drivers. But this certain cab driver said something really, really significant, and I think it's worth sharing it because when I was driving through Kabul, a lot of places in Kabul are named after warlords, Mujahideen commanders who participated in the war against the Soviet Union in the 1980s and who also later destroyed Kabul in the 1990s when the Afghan civil war erupted. Or like other places are named after other questionable historical figures and personalities who were tyrants, who oppressed whole populations, who killed a lot of people. And the cab driver said, come on, stop this. We should really name all these places or rename all these places after the victims of these people, of the average Afghans who suffered. And when someone asks you, hey, who is this guy? I never heard the name of this person. The street name, I never heard the name of the person which the name of the street is after. So we should tell them that this was one of the victims, and we should celebrate at least their legacy and not the ones of their murderers.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me. I'd like today to talk about some research that I've been doing for the past few years around a project called Palestine Open Maps and the implications of this project on open data. My presentation is titled Open Data Memory and Erasure. First, I'd like to talk about I'd like to make two quotes that have really framed what I'm talking about in this session. The first one is by Salman Abu Sitta, who's basically the godfather of Palestinian maps. He's been collecting maps since like the 1960s, I think, and he talks about how foreigners have been wanting to go to Palestine and map it for a very long time. And they wanted to know the intimate and physical details and historical characteristics as a prelude to conquering the land. So that's one thing, one quote that I'd like to keep it as a framing for this session. The other quote that I'd like to include is by Antonio Gramsci from the Prison Notebooks. And he talks about that the historical processes have deposited in us an infinity of traces without leaving an inventory. And our task as historians, as geographers, as scholars, is to make an inventory of those tasks, and as people in general. I'd like to think about certain traces that I've seen in my research. And the traces that I want to focus on today are those of Lubia. In those two images, you can see the top image is an image of Lubia today, or a few years ago when I went to visit. And the bottom image is that of Lubia the day it was being ethnically cleansed during the Nakba in 1948 in order to create an ethnically Jewish state, majority Jewish state. The traces that you see in the images, you'll like as you're walking around Lubia, you'll see like a well here, a well there, a few like a wild cactus or a cactus that has grown wild here, and a cactus that has grown wild there. And then what you realize is that path that you're walking on is actually a path, a street or a road that used to exist. And it might actually even be the road that the people of Lubia walked down, or my grandmother, who was from Lubia, walked down as she was being ethnically cleansed. The other thing that you will see is maps of Lubia that are deposited in this open data repository or open knowledge repository that we call Wikipedia. The maps that you see here are maps made by the British colonial authorities in the 30s and 40s, and some of them even before. But I want to also zoom in onto these maps and talk about how they got there. They got there from Palestine Open Maps, a project that I've been working on with Visualizing Palestine and my colleague Ahmed Barkley. And here you can see two maps of Lubia, one from 1946, which was 2 years before the Nakba, and you can see the toponym of Lubia in the center with the roads that connect it surrounding it. And on the right, you will see the a map published just after the creation of Israel by the Survey of Israel, with the exact same features minus the toponym of Lubia. So I want to talk about how these traces of historical data came to us and reached us today. Those maps were made by the British surveyors who came in with the colonial authorities, as I said, again, going back to the quote of Salman Abu Sitta. And he has been, at the beginning, it was unimaginable for British surveyors to actually have any non-British surveyors on the survey of Palestine. But eventually what we saw is that as they started compiling those maps, which you can see a sample of on the right, they didn't have the capacity to produce the entire survey of Palestine. And so they enlisted the help of Palestinian surveyors. So as you can see on the image to the left, there's a school for surveyors that was created by the Survey of Palestine to train Palestinian and Arab surveyors to produce the maps. And you can see in the middle image the training at the school, and to the right are the actual documents of that they produced ultimately at the British Library in London, UK. These maps, after being created, they were distributed all over the world. A lot of copies ended up in different archives. One of them is the National Library of Israel archive, which actually has digitized those maps and put them online. And that's how we access them to create Palestine Open Maps. What we did is that we took each map, cut out the frame, stitched it together, put it online, as you can see in this image. And there were 3 necessary conditions for these maps to actually become accessible to us and be available on Palestine Open Maps, and to have the access that made them eventually land on Wikipedia. One of them is the technical infrastructure. There's a massive set of open source tools that we rely on in the day-to-day of creating those maps and publishing them. It would be impossible for us to create it from scratch. So we rely on open source tools. We also rely on the public domain, and as the original maps that were created by the British surveyors, they are owned by the Crown, and that ownership was expired after 50 years of their publication. So now they are in the public domain, which allows us to reuse them without any restrictions. The third aspect that was necessary was the digitization of these maps by different archival institutions. So we got some of the digitized maps from the Israeli National Archive, but we also got other maps from the David Ramsey map collection. And without these 3 different components, we would never have been able to create Palestine Open Maps. But the question becomes, who is the owner of these maps? Is it the British Crown, actually? Legally, it's the British Crown, even though now the maps are in public domain. But if it was Palestinians who created these maps, as the British survey actually became mostly Palestinian, but the British Survey of Palestine became mostly Palestinian by the end of it, just before the Nakba. Who owns these maps? And to answer kind of this question and to kind of turn it upside down, we decided to kind of indigenize these maps. And the way that we do it is that by disassembling those maps into the individual data points that they contain. And the way I do that is by using open source tools to train hundreds of mappers to redraw basically the entire map using GIS technologies to kind of disassemble the map, and we reassemble it in a way to and publish all of the data under an open data license, which I'll get into in a bit. Uh, the Open Data License is an Open Data Commons attribution license, which allows anyone to take the data and do anything they want with it. And obviously, as Palestinians, we benefit greatly from the existence of this data. We can assert our historical presence. We can produce new forms of knowledge that combine this data with other databases to produce new forms of knowledge. And my colleague Ahmed Barkley has created, for example, that has combined this data with the Palestinian Oral History Archive data to create an oral history spatial navigation tool. And what we're also doing is that we're connecting younger Palestinians with the intimate details of the land. As a Palestinian refugee growing up in Palestinian refugee camps in Yarmouk, I went to school in Al Carmel. My grandparents' house was on Lubia Street. All of these places I knew personally by name, but I never knew the physical description of them without, except orally through the stories of my grandparents. Now I see how they look like through those maps, and so do all of other Palestinians who have seen these maps as well. But the problem is that this presents a dilemma. As we present the maps and we open the data publicly, this presents a dilemma, which is, what about adversarial use? Can there be people who we don't want to be using these maps, using them nevertheless? And this is a problem that's faced by a lot of open data repositories. For example, a lot of Palestinian botanists, when they produce their data, they put it on open data repositories such as iNaturalist. And the iNaturalist data is open and anyone can use it. The problem is that will it be used by the Israeli authorities to control Palestinian access to wild plants in Palestine, as they do? For example, it's like in Israeli law, it's illegal to collect zatar from the mountains, the wild zatar, which is like an essential part of Palestinian diets. It's unimaginable for us to not collect wild zatar, but it's illegal under Israeli law. Will this open data be used against us as Palestinians? So the reactionary response to this question is to act as gatekeepers to this data, and so it becomes a question of like I own the data, and I'm the only person who allows or disallows anyone from using it, with a very kind of authoritarian approach to this data creation and data access. But what I would like to propose is an alternative approach, which is a stewardship approach, which actually has been pioneered by a lot of indigenous organizations and indigenous data groups across the world. And we have models that resemble this in the Arabic-speaking world or in the Islamic world in general. There is the idea of the waqf, which is a trust, basically, a land trust that is governed for the collective benefit of the community for charitable reasons. But it could also be adapted in a way for data. I don't see why it couldn't be. Same concept, which is the musha' or the commons. Can we adapt the commons to be a secular vehicle for data repositories that rely on collective benefit? So the Global Indigenous Data Alliance talks about open data in two different ways. First, they say that, like, yes, data has to be open in the traditional sense, which like they use the acronym, the FAIR acronym, which is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. So they say, yes, open data should be fair, but they should also follow the CARE principles, which mean that they are targeted towards a collective benefit. They recognize the authority to control the data, and they engender a responsibility for nurturing relationships within communities that the data comes from, and they promote ethical practices to maximize benefits and minimize harms. So this is a framework that I think could be adapted and matched with the WACF framework to promote open data use in our region and around the world. That's it. I think I've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Very much for those 3 videos. I want to take this opportunity to remind everyone, if you have a question, please post it in the chat. And without further ado, I will launch into my own question first. I wanted to ask all of the presenters, what difference does your generational location make in terms of praxis and activism, excuse me, especially when compared to, say, established scholars and activists who lived through the end of the Cold War and have memories from before the global war on terror began? Some of our previous speakers identified Desert Storm in 1991 as beginning in their own political engagement. How does the fact that you grew up in the midst of a particular war matter to your perception of other struggles? And please feel free to jump right in to answer it.
Heavy question. I was thinking as Imran was talking about his conversation with the taxi driver about walking around and or like seeing the street names named after specific warlords. I was remembering in Yarmouk, for example, or in Palestinian refugee camps in general, every feature, every street, every hospital, every school is named after a Palestinian village, like the 500 plus villages that have been ethnically cleansed. And I'm thinking, like there's some interesting like parallels there, like about how like being engulfed in those place names that like you cannot turn around without being reminded of this presence, kind of affects how we like the direction in which we take our research and in which we like raise our like raise the questions that bubble up in our minds. And I don't know, Imran, do you feel like the street names were something that kind of framed how you talk about this stuff?
Yeah, first of all, thanks a lot for these great contributions. I really enjoyed all of them, and with all the details. And regarding your question, I don't, maybe later, to be honest. I mean, I think it's different in Afghanistan than what you described in Yarmouk camp with the villages, because Afghanistan, when it comes to the situation in Palestine, I think a lot of things are very obvious and clear for many of us, but Afghanistan was like haunted by so many kinds of different wars and interests during the last 4 decades and beyond. So for that reason, I think for example, naming these places, the streets you described after villages, makes total sense, because in my opinion, it makes total sense, because just that people remember them and the places where they come from. In the context of Afghanistan, you have, of course, you have people who have different political backgrounds, and you find people who supported these warlords or politicians and ex-presidents, etc. And you have people, and nowadays you have, I think, much more people who are just very critical towards it and don't want to hear the names of any of them. But regarding my own political thinking and activism, and because Karim mentioned all these scholars who talked about Operation Desert Storm and things that happened in the 80s, in the 90s, or even earlier, I think that in a crude way, it was maybe somehow similar for myself. Also, I was born in 1991, but I grew up with all the news about these wars, of course, as a child of refugees coming from a country which was haunted by war. You grew up with all these things, and especially, of course, after 9/11 happened, it was like, because I also wrote a lot about these things during the last year and during the last month, I think that all this political thinking of mine started back then. So, in a very young age, but this was probably the case for all of us.
I just want to extend thank yous like everyone else. It's super fascinating to hear the talks. I think this is an interesting question because of the way, especially in US culture, particular moments of history are like categorized, right? So we like remember like a 9/11 moment, and then we like remember like a Desert Storm, right? And if you're an immigrant in this country, like your own personal experiences bump up against those categorizations, because for a lot of us, there's like just, there has never been a condition in the United States in which it was not involved in a war of empire, like ever, right? Right. I mean, this nation, like the country was built on an assault on indigenous sovereignty. So it was like an empire from the beginning. And so I think something that happens to a lot of folks that like come from immigrant communities is we start to like piece together parts of our childhood that in which like we didn't even recognize or have the political vocabulary to recognize were moments of politics, right? But because they don't fit those clean like narratives of what it means to be, politically left-leaning in this country. And I remember this, like when Clinton decided to bomb, like in the Bosnian conflict, right? Like, I was in the masjid with my father, and I was like a kid. I didn't have any idea what was going on, but like they were talking about it, and it was like the space where this conversation was being held. And I think one of the things that like, at least for myself and a lot of folks that I work with, like you start to realize you have to suture those memories into your own historiography a little bit to recognize that politicization was how you came into this world because of the effects of empire, because those are also very, very formulaic, I think, informative.
I just want to follow up on that and sort of ask you a bit about, each of you is working on memory in the context of a digital project. And I'm wondering how you think digital technologies are sort of reworking our relationship to memory and questions of memory. So I'm thinking here, obviously, of things like the Wayback Machine and archive.org, which are certain kinds of digital archives. But then also there is, Black Cube, which is about erasure. There are practices now where newspapers are changing their digital articles without leaving a trace of the editing that they're doing. So we have real-time editing happening without any kind of public trace of what's happening. So I'm wondering whether you think the memory of things and peoples that are marginalized or who are marginalized is made more difficult in this era. And then I have to have a follow-up, but I'm curious about this first bit.
Should I go?
Sure.
Yeah, there's two parts. I think like on the one hand, like we actually have a problem that's that it's like, and the EU has been introducing a lot of interesting legislation around this, the right to be forgotten and so on, because like often we say that the internet is written in ink, right? Not in pencil. And it's very easy to look up, dredge up some like old minor petty crimes that someone has done, and like that affects their current future, employment prospects, housing prospects, etc. Also, like my Facebook account, which doesn't exist anymore, has existed since the beginning of Facebook. The mesh that was back then should not be visible today, right? So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, it's like you said, it is very possible to erase. Like we know that there's a Twitter account, I'm trying to remember the name of, that takes the New York Times headlines and traces how they've kind of changed every time. And depending on the public feedback, etc. I think like, and I do think that like on the balance between should we preserve memory as much as possible, or should we should we have the right to be erased and forgotten and not be visible in the first place, I tend to lean towards the right to be invisible. And there's many reasons for that, but I think one of the main reasons is that not everything that can be recorded should be recorded, and I think the interest in like the widespread interest in like adding the stories feature in every single app that you would see around is kind of demonstrative of that. Like people don't want every trace that they produce to be preserved forever, and whatever reaches us is, I think, is what we have to work with as scholars or researchers in the future or activists in the future. And like what we try to do is to kind of disable as much as possible the surveillance powers that will make use of this data today, as opposed to think of the future historians that will come in, I don't know how many years.
Let me just sort of ask in a follow-up way, Sarah, for instance, you mentioned, the need to have a kind of a different kind of relationship to archiving and cataloging. And I'm wondering how your organization kind of concretizes that. And secondly, there's this question of opacity, right? Scholars like Simone Brown, Ruha Benjamin, and others have talked about the strategic necessity of not revealing too much about vulnerable populations. So how do you in your work sort of negotiate that with archiving and knowledge sharing on the one hand, but also having to engage this question around vulnerability?
I think the question of who you're archiving matters, right? Like if you're archiving, for instance, police tech vendors, it's not really a question of privacy, but if you're taking meeting notes in a collective space and there's a concern over, especially if you know that you're being targeted for surveillance, a lot of organizations based in the 2020 uprisings, like you want to be careful. And obviously there's like operational like security and things like that. I think one way to answer this is to mark a kind of shift that happened during the 2020 uprisings, because a lot of the surveillance was being used to actively disorganize street movements, right? And so we needed to think about it in an extremely like pragmatic sense. It was like this moment of creating political theory simultaneous to creating strategies and tactics. And the shift that happened was we started to look at digital security as a collective threat as opposed to an individual threat, right? We started to recognize that like you not taking your phone to a protest wasn't about necessarily you, it was about everybody that phone contacts, right? And that chain of criminalization. And started to recognize that like a lot of the intelligence, a lot of like, the modes of computational thinking that are prevalent now are only prevalent because they amass and aggregate and analyze. And so thinking about risk and security and thinking about benefits collectively, I think was one of the big organizational shifts we made, and making sure that we prioritize that, because, if you start to think about these things individually, which I think like there's a lot of market impetus to make you do that, right? You start to think about like, what do I not have? What am I barred from? Things like that, right? And then you come up with really politically confusing problems, like the facial recognition technology doesn't recognize me. That's really sad for me, right? That makes life really hard for me. And then you create a market incentive to facilitate the criminalization of entire categories of people, right? So I think that's one shift that we experience, but a lot of this is like implementing those political theoretical shifts on a very much grounded level and how we're moving day to day, I think.
I'd like to come in on that and think about how, using the example that Sarah said, leaving one's phone behind when you go to an organizational meeting, to what extent are there limits to the retooling of technology as a tool of resistance? Is this something that can be taken from the master's house to use it against the master, to borrow from every lord, or are there no limits to it and this is something that can be retooled by activists?
Let me add, I mean, this goes back, Majd, you and I had a conversation a long time ago. And I think this goes back in part to that kind of question, and Imran to the question of the drone memorial as well, which is we're using these technologies, Majd in your case and Imran in your case, to make certain marginal communities visible, or communities that are being erased and people that are being erased visible. And that's an important political gesture. But at what point do we say enough? We're tired of having to make ourselves visible. It should not have to be that, you know, you have to produce counter maps and like all of this armature just to say that Palestinians exist, or just to say that there are drone victims in Afghanistan, that this should not be up for the kind of, I mean, because part of the reason the questioning arises is precisely because we are brown and black peoples, right? We see this happening as a counterpoint with Ukraine, the kind of trust that the West has had with whatever Ukrainians are doing, versus the kind of suspicion that they have had for brown and black folks. So I'm wondering,
Exactly.
kind of, yeah. Please.
Yeah, try to summarize all the thoughts I just have. So first of all, what I wanted to add regarding drone memorial and how it is important to protect certain communities. I mean, this was also very crucial regarding this work, because not just because of the fact that I didn't have all the resources to add much more details or as much details as possible. I also came to the conclusion that, you know, it's just better to have these names at first and not adding the detailed location maps, or even pictures of the settings, pictures of the victims or their relatives, because of course I have a lot of such data, but I thought it's not really intelligent to share it, because on the one side you benefit from such technology, from all these things that 21st century offers. You can use it as some kind of resistance. You can use it as a memory which is visible for everyone and all around the world. But on the other side, you have a lot of folks, who you shouldn't trust, and who could benefit from such kind of data in a negative way, and they would affect these communities. I mean, I don't know if probably some drone analyst who's working for the CIA would use these maps and all that stuff to add it to his archive or whatever database he or she's using. And so these things are really also dangerous. So at the moment, if you just go to the website, you'd see these names, which are basically very typical names all around Afghanistan and Pakistan, mostly average Pashtun names, and that's it. That's just what I wanted to add. And yeah, but on the other side, of course, Madiha, your question makes total sense. How often do you want to remind Western people that, hey, listen to us, these are our victims, and you have to acknowledge it. To be honest, I don't know how often it is necessary, because it's of course really annoying. It makes you tired, and you see how problematic as it is, because we have already mentioned Ukraine, the ongoing war in Ukraine, and how you see a total shift of narratives, because white Westerners are affected by this war. And there are many different aspects that we could focus on. For example, what I mentioned in this presentation that you showed was the number of 43,000 war terror victims in Afghanistan, which is, of course, I think, a very low minimum. We have now a war in Europe, in Ukraine, and you don't even find proper numbers about the people who are being killed there, and because it's difficult. Although, of course, obviously, there's much more interest. You have, it's a very specific moment. You have, like, I don't know, some people even. I have Russian. I know, people who have a Russian background, and I talked with other friends, and they were like, maybe for them it's now like for us 20 years ago. after 9/11. You know, these comparisons. So it's a crucial time, and but to come back to the numbers, when it comes to the numbers of the war and terror victims, also of drone strike victims all around the world, you know, many of these strikes took place in very remote areas, and let's be honest, the whole majority of reporters, analysts, activists were not interested to visit these places. So yeah, there was a huge lack of interest, and there is still a huge lack of interest, and yeah, we we shouldn't become tired to shout what happened, to shout it out, because that's basically what I did back then, and I didn't expect that. You know, back then I didn't expect that we would talk about this project in 2022.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think, you know, one of the very interesting things that came out of that, Imran, was this idea of indigenizing technology. Majd, I think that's something that you're doing a little bit. You spoke about indigenizing maps. What might that look like if the maps you worked on were not, say, colonial era maps, but were those that were produced during the Ottoman era, or perhaps even Egyptian maps of Palestine?
Can I just respond to the previous point, and then I'll come back to this? I think we live in a really interesting moment. I think the ground is shifting below our feet, and we're still trying to figure out like what shifted, how, and like how do we position ourselves right now, especially with the crazy disinformation and misinformation war complementing the physical war. I think there's something really like we're trying to grasp on and we're trying to make sense of, but it's becoming really difficult. But there are certain attempts that are happening, and I think archival practice in itself, memory making and memory recording, is an attempt at making sense of this. And this goes back to the Gramsci quote that I quoted at the very beginning. I think there's something really interesting that we are doing as archival practitioners, whether in Palestine or the US or in Afghanistan or anywhere else, that has two parts. One, when you're working on an archive, you're building a record that will become accessible, and the usage of that record is one output. But there is another output that we don't talk about often enough, which is the effect of the archive itself, the process of the creation of the archive on the archival practitioners and on the community that the archive serves. And I think an archive that's well done has a is cognizant of its political dimensions and the political act of archiving, and does something else, which is activates the archive itself for a political cause. Doesn't pretend to be neutral, doesn't pretend to be an innocent archive. I just came across this paper this morning. I haven't read it yet, but I think it was recommended to me. Archiving Praxis for Palestine and Beyond by Anne-Laure Stoller. And I think there's a previous iteration of my talk actually was titled Archives as Training Grounds for Democracy. And I think there's some at this point we're kind of because we're kind of in this moment of transformation, we're trying to imagine a future by understanding the present and the past. And I think that's the political role of archives. I hope this answers the question in a way. And then to go back to the question of indigenization, I used to switch back and forth between the term indigenization and decolonization of archives. I'm trying to kind of veer away as much as possible from the term decolonization, just because I want it to be a much more I want land to be the basis of that question as opposed to anything else, more than memory. so I've been trying to use the term indigenization, and what part of that, for example, was like the maps that we're working with have like the transliterated place names in Latin letters. Reversing the transliteration kind of brings back those maps to the people who created them. I was as Imran was presenting his memorial, I was thinking actually, like in the transliteration that you use into English, you're using a specific like I wonder if the CIA analyst is looking back at this archive or at this list and is trying to go back to the original name and trying to find the way that it's written in Pashtun. Would it like how difficult would it be to reverse the transliteration and is actually like writing the names in Latin a form of obfuscating, adding another layer of obfuscation, more than just using very common names, just like having a layer of obfuscation that the transliteration makes it more difficult for the analysts to connect the data that they've collected, that they have their own databases with the databases of with the list of names. And this is like goes back to the definition, like what is big data, right? And it's not just lots of data, because lots of data is like there has always been lots of data. The question of big data, I think Rob Kitchen talks about this, is data that is connected to other data. And so maybe in the gesture that you're making, Imran, in the transliteration, is that you're making it more difficult to make this into a form of big data. I think, Sarah, do you have something to add to this?
Not as much about indigenizing data. It's really fascinating to think about different kinds of data sovereignty, but the question about retooling, I'm not sure if everyone on this panel is going to sit on the same side of the fence when it comes to that. So I think it's an interesting provocation. But I'm actually I would reject the terms of the question a little bit, because it's one that I get asked a lot. This like techno optimism versus like technophobia. Where do you sit on the spectrum? Because a lot of that comes from, I think, this desire to force people to adjudicate what is a good or bad technology, right? Like you have to figure out what's biased, what's racist, and all of that just ultimately comes down to this collective exercise of trying to preserve white innocence, which I just have no interest in doing, right? Because it's a foregone conclusion for me. Like the internet is a compromised technology because it literally conditions the possibility for the very homicides that Imran is memorializing, right? So that that's not a question, right? Like when you think about the fact that in the United States, computing is a war industry, the violence that these technologies make possible is a foregone conclusion. But I don't think that it helps to punish in those conditions of global counterinsurgency freedom-seeking behavior, right? Like that's not what we're all gonna try and experiment different things, and we're gonna learn from those experiments, and those things are gonna be complicated, they're gonna be contradictory and things like that. I think ultimately what you're seeing isn't a retooling of technology, it's just different kinds of freedom-seeking behavior, and that's existed for as long as empire and even longer than that, and will continue to exist in so many different forms, right? For some people, freedom-seeking behavior is building your own servers. For other people, freedom-seeking behavior is waking up for Fajr, right? Like it's just so complicated, different, and dense. And so I really want to pull folks out of this conversation of is the technology good or bad? Because, I think the status quo kind of just answers that question flatly. We don't need to do that.
I sort of have a kind of a follow-up question. Sarah, you talk about the distant kin who are, as a consequence of our actions as people based in the United States with access to these technologies are using, things like facial recognition, and then these are being used by these, it's making these technologies better, and they're being used on our distant kin. And what strikes me there about your use of the term distant kin is that, to me, I think the technology is doing a kind of kin making, isn't it? I mean, it's what what links me to all of those others being surveilled are certain racial features, phenotypes, genomics. But now that is being read as a kind of, as being part of the same group and the part of the same suspect group. So I was wondering if you could reflect a little bit on making kin as an anti-racist practice versus kin making, which also happens in racism and through racist tech.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think I would just like, I don't think that's kin. I don't think what they're doing is kin making. I think they're identifying bodies to murder and kill, right? And so I think that modality is just completely different. But I think another way to approach this question is to think about how relationships were severed in the first place. So I'm from Bangladesh, and like I came into this world a climate migrant because of river erosion before Al Gore made his film, and it was like an actual concept, right? And like when you think about why, like growing up and when I did in the United States, I had to find Bangladeshi people on the internet and connect with them, right? It's fascinating to like connect that moment of internet history when we're all like creating live journals and things like that, like trying to find our people, to the reality that conditioned the alienation in the first place, right? Which was like the extractive economies that pushed us out of where our kin were and forced us into conditions of migration. And then the internet is sold back to us as like, this is how you're going to find your community, right? So I think that like, what makes kin distant, what forces the conditions of migration, I think those questions start to surface a lot of like these tactics of alienation that get leveraged to break kinship in the first place. So much more interesting than how the state identifies us as being kin, I think, is how the state uses that to demobilize, depoliticize, and fracture movements.
Thank you. I wanted to bring in Imran. Imran, I'm really struck by your example of the George Floyd mural in Afghanistan. And I kind of, this is an example where the murder of a Black man in the United States and the protest movement against that murder is being used apparently by the State Department to erase Afghans murdered by the United States in Afghanistan. And I was wondering, kind of in your conversations with Afghans, what kinds of reactions were there by people around it? I can imagine a range of things, but I'm curious to hear what the reactions were. And then I guess the follow-up question that I have is perhaps for Sarah, but anybody can jump in. It's like, for us as US-based scholars and activists, this is a kind of interesting space to have to negotiate, where George Floyd here in this example is both a man murdered by the domestic police in the United States, but in this kind of circulation, also an imperial citizen whose death is circulating, as and resounding more loudly in a public context than the death of Afghans themselves, which is what Imran, I think, is pointing out. So how do we, on the one hand, draw the links between imperial violence and domestic policing on the one hand, while also being kind of mindful of this dynamic of the deaths that circulate and deaths that do not? I think what I'm asking in some ways is a bigger question about abolitionist thought and kind of how do we take into account the specifics of colonialism and imperialism. But I want to start with Imran and sort of get your thoughts about how this played out in Afghanistan.
Sure. So the thing is that the responsible artists who drew this image was a group called Art Lords, and they were quite famous in Kabul, especially in this green zone NGO bubble, So and they were also funded by the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. Obviously, if you talk to people who were part of this bubble, they expressed their admiration and they thought it was cool and they didn't question much of it. That's what I felt. But if you talk to regular people on the street in Kabul, they didn't know what was going on. They were like, who's this guy? And what's about this graffiti? Because I think on the one side you had George Floyd, and on the other side, I think it was the Iranian flag, because back then Iranian border guards killed Afghan refugees who tried to enter the country. So they tried to frame it in this context. But of course, it was also kind of legitimate. But as I said, you know, the elephant in the room, nobody talked about the elephant in the room. And if you talk to Afghans who were from, especially diaspora Afghans who had relatives in rural parts of Afghanistan who were affected by drone strikes and all these American policies, they immediately were like, you know, what is this? This is total hypocrisy. And also other people who were much more familiar with global events, but also about the role, you know, with the role of US empire, especially in Afghanistan, they question it. But I also met a lot of people who didn't question it, to be honest. And also, especially those Afghans who were part of these NGO bubble and who also benefited from it. I mean, you know, they get a lot of money from Western embassies. They didn't like to hear it, and they also didn't dare to question these policies, although, you know, they happened in front of them. You could hear the war in Afghanistan, the war on terror. You know, of course, during the last 20 years, the war took place in many different forms. Like in Kabul, you had suicide attacks and, you know, all these insurgent attacks by the Taliban and other groups, which kill a lot of civilians. At the same time, in the rural areas, you had the classical war on terror and, you know, all these airstrikes and night raids, etc. And what was often kind of a surprise was that a lot of people I met in the urban areas, they, especially in this bubble, they were not really aware. They didn't want to hear what was happening abroad, you know, abroad outside of Kabul. And the more I explained it to them, because also a lot of these people didn't leave the city. You know, it wasn't, as I said, it's not just that Westerners stayed in this bubble. Also, a lot of Afghans who worked there stayed there and became part of it instead of questioning a lot of policies and a lot of things that were happening. So the more I talked about it, the more some other colleagues talked about it, the more they became aware of it, and of course started to question it. I mean, let's be honest, most people know that most Afghans didn't know that, you know, the militarization of the American police is linked to the war on terror in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries, for example.
Thank you. Sarah, do you have thoughts?
There's this essay that the formerly imprisoned political prisoner Laura Whitehorn had written about, I think it's called Resisting the Ordinary. And it's about like, and she's writing with other imprisoned political prisoners in the United States and writing about Abu Ghraib and the reaction to those images, right? And I think it was Herman Bell who commented that like, Abu Ghraib is just another day in the plantation. And I think what's so interesting about that is that like, for a lot of us, those images, like that and what they symbolize in terms of the war on terror was like this moment of spectacular, extreme violence. And for folks who have contact with the US injustice system, like those are just like, that's just prison life, right? Those forms of sexual degradation and like quotidian humiliation, that's prison life here. And so it started to get me thinking about like what made those violations possible and what the connections were, for instance, between the US Supermax prison and what happened in Abu Ghraib, right? And Dylan Rodriguez has this book, Forced Passages, where he talks about like the continuity between different sites of violence as being spaces of pedagogy for white violence, right? So like you learn about particular modes of violence on this Middle Passage, right? Then you learn about particular modes of violence on the plantation and you know, the reservation. And these sites become ways in which that cultural practice of violence circulates and it's like enacted and taught and things like that, right? So the question doesn't just become, how does the US Supermax prison teach a culture to do Abu Ghraib? It's also, what did they learn in Abu Ghraib that they then brought back here, right? And those like continuities, I think you start to like hold in a way that forces you to recognize that the reason why a lot of these tools of war that's being used in Standing Rock, that's being used in Portland, Oregon, that's being used in Afghanistan start to resemble each other is because this is a global empire, right? So it's acting like a global empire does, and it's learning from different sites of violence that it enacts in order to be a global empire.
Thank you, Sarah. Majd, I wanted to bring you into the conversation a bit and to shift gears and think about these adversarial the adversarial potential for the use of data. The Global Digital Indigenous Data Alliance, which you mentioned, has these CARE principles. You explained that beautifully in terms of stewardship they're responding to. And then there's this question of data sovereignty as part, excuse me, of Indigenous sovereignty on the one hand, and let's say anarchic principles embedded in the idea of open data on the other hand, which doesn't necessarily take into account that some groups are in highly unequal relationships. Some people have their data that is visible and under contestation, while others don't have data and yet they don't have sovereignty. How do you see these principles as responding to the question of the potential adversarial use of data? Is the potential misuse and harmful use of data ultimately something that we just have to live with?
Yeah, so two parts to the answer. One, or to response to, I guess. One is that we don't have actually, like when we talk at the core of this question is the question of data ownership, I think, one. And then another question is a question of power. And when we talk about data ownership, it's a much more complex question than we imagine. So, like, let's say like at least in Canada, I can say this, where I'm based. Your medical data, for example, is you don't own your medical data. So when you go to the doctor and they do an X-ray, for example, and you don't own the X-ray. You can have a copy of it, but you don't own the image. So something even as personal as that is not your, like, there's no legal definition of data ownership in that case. So within the legal frameworks, and we can contest those, of course, but within those legal frameworks, the data ownership that we're talking about, like, it has very, very shaky grounds. And then, and then we think about the question of adversarial use. And this is a question that has been like circulating around like digital freedom communities for a long time, and there is always this this kind of like seemingly contradictory impulses within those communities. One that says that drives us towards like openness, and the other that drives us towards privacy. And you see a lot of like, you see the big conferences, the people who attend the open conferences are often, there's a big overlap with the people who attend the privacy conferences. So there is a significant overlap, and I think they're often framed as contradictory, but I think we need to think about them as complementary influences. And this kind of also goes, and to kind of ground this question goes back to what Sarah was saying about like the practice of security is not an individual practice, but a collective one. And once we start thinking about collective right to data, and collective right to privacy, and collective right to ownership, we can counter this this adversarial use in more interesting ways. And that's why I was thinking about the data waqf, or like creating a custodianship model that will kind of in a way do a harm mitigation approach to data usage from adversarial entities. Of course, there's like Like we know that licensing is really super difficult to enforce in a lot of different ways. And like we know that, for example, Microsoft scraped all of GitHub, which they now own, to get all of the code that has been written in it to create an AI, like basically autocomplete tool for people who write code, based on the millions, billions lines of code that exist as open data. There was no explicit permission given from the people who wrote and deposited their code in GitHub to Microsoft to actually give to use this data in this way. But there was no explicit denial of permission in either. So I'm thinking, like, can we would a data trust or a data waqf approach kind of circumvent this this dilemma?
For that, Majd. There's actually a question for me, which I will quickly answer. And then because we are at 2:41 now, I would love to have your closing thoughts, which, you know, I'd love to know what is sort of the one takeaway that you would like audiences to kind of take away from your really substantive engagements. The question that I received was, Madiha, Google Maps produces a map of Palestine. Is the information provided there of value to your work? So my work is not on Palestine. It's on it's on drone warfare in the Pakistan-Afghanistan borderlands, what were called the federally administered tribal areas, and the war on terror that's been happening there. So that's drone strikes, but it's also Pakistani military operations and a lot of other things happening in that region. And I would say, you know, Majd and I, again, have had this conversation in the past. You know, the data is often very degraded for these regions. In some places, when drone strikes happening, some of the data, the visual satellite imagery has clouds that have been placed there in order to obscure what one is able to see. So that's one issue. The other issue I would say is that I think, you know, these maps are useful, but at the end of the day, I think ultimately there has been a tendency to, I think sometimes, to think of data or the establishment of this kind of work as leading to movements, when actually I think it happens often the other way around, which is movements give meaning to our projects, whatever they might be. So in Pakistan, we've now had an anti-war movement called the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, or the Pashtun protection movement. And, you know, at its peak, it has been able to mobilize counter truths about both the Pakistani state violence and also US imperial violence. And the last thing I'll say is, I think one of the interesting things has been, you know, not thinking about GIS maps, but thinking about hand-drawn maps, which give us different kinds of information that sometimes is not commensurable with the GIS maps, but does tell us, you know, the kinds of daily life that people live with, the number of checkpoints they have to go through, the kinds of, you know, listening to them narrate as they draw these maps tells us the difficulties that they face and what happens at each of these checkposts that they have to go through, and gives us a lot of different kind of information. So I think that there's a possibility to kind of also work with these maps, but also to supplement them with other kinds of stuff that's not commensurable with them. So that's my answer to that. I would love to hear your thoughts about kind of what are your takeaways and what do you see happening in the future with this kind of work that you're doing. So Imran, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. So I think that we, the audience, everyone saw three very different topics, you know, yeah, I think very different topics taking place on different parts of the world, but they're really, really, you know, closely connected to each other. And I hope that more and more people see this. It's important to draw the lines from police violence to Afghanistan or Pakistan, and also to Palestine. Also, the topic of maps in general, what Majd is doing so greatly, it's also so important in many other contexts. And I hope that yeah, people see these lines and connect the dots with each other. Regarding the future of my work, well, as I hinted before, it has become a bit difficult, you know, to continue this one-man project, because so much is taking place for many months now, and it's difficult to continue doing this. I mean, in the case of Afghanistan, at least, some positive news is that Afghanistan is not the most drone-bombed country anymore, because all of these total majority of these airstrikes, I think at the moment really 100%. There are some reports about drones hovering over Nuristan and Kunar province, close to the Pakistani border. Difficult to confirm what kinds of drones we have here, if they are American drones or Pakistani drones. But you know, overall, drone war in Afghanistan stopped for now, and this is for many people on the ground. You know, although Taliban are back and all these headlines we had during the last months, for many people in the affected areas, this is a huge, you know, huge aspect, important aspect, a positive development actually. And yeah, but at the same time, I mean, especially in these days, while the war in Ukraine is taking, I heard of drone strikes in Somalia. You know, it's still happening. So actually, there's still a lot of work to do, and hopefully, I will be able to find a solution.
Thank you. Sarah?
And yeah, thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thanks for having us. I think this is fascinating in terms of just building like those connections that Imran's talking about, and just loved hearing about everyone's work. And you know, I think we're all on the right track, right? We keep doing what we're doing, and then Palestine will be free, US empire will be abolished, and you know, we move towards a better world because it's possible. I think that's one of the fascinating things about all of this work, is being so diverse, is that we are obviously all extremely optimistic about what we can achieve if we keep struggling, right? So thank you again. Yeah, and it was wonderful to learn from you.
Majd?
Yeah,
The last word.
thank you, Sarah. I like what you said about like, it's like ultimately at the root of it, what we're doing is very optimistic, even if as Gramsci says, like we are like the pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will, right? I think one of the really like comforting things that like in these encounters is that I think like in a way what we're doing is kind of like an interventionist scholarship, you know, and this is really hopeful for me, because we kind of we're doing experiments. A lot of us, I think, if anyone says they know exactly how the world works and how everything is functioning, they're lying, right? And what we're doing here is experiments in understanding how everything works. And the thing that we need the most right now is experiments. And I'm glad that there is so many of them happening right now. Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you so much. I'd really like to thank you all. This was such a wonderful, engaging discussion. We'd also like to thank our audience, and we want to thank several faculty members, including Manan Ahmed, Marwa Elshakry, and Brinkley Messick, who have co-organized this series with us. Technologies of Power has been made possible with the support of the Dean of Humanities at Columbia University, as well as the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, the Departments of History and Anthropology, and the Middle East Institute. And of course, through support of our current home institutions, my institution, Arizona State University, and the University of Toronto, where Adrien Zakar is, who is not able to be with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks. Thank you so much, you guys.